Hello, welcome to GSX. I'm Landon Winkelvoss, one of the co-founders of Nisos. So today we're going to be talking about managed intelligence. So let's just get that out of the way, real quick. What is managed intelligence? It's threat intelligence as a managed service, right? So how do we do what we do, and what's our magic sauce? We'll kind of talk about over the next 20 minutes. So background, I was a former technical targeting officer with the U.S. intelligence community. And I was working with a lot of the operators, working with remote operators, forensic investigators, technical targeters, FBI agents, you name it. And it was pretty interesting, because when we look at what intelligence was in the private sector, it was ultimately data. Right. I think that there's no shortage of data feeds, around this, around this sector. And the question was, of course, you have the idea of how can you do it better? So the question is, can we build a company where we're aggregating all the data and we're actually providing intelligence, which is basically the answer? And we can do that. And so of course, then we go out, we start the business, and so the question is, what problems are you going to solve, right? What quickly became, and of course, in your first year of business, you'll do anything, for revenue, right? Just, give anything a try, right? Because you work your community, you work your network. And so what became, pretty obvious pretty quick was that we have the ability to solve problems across many disciplines: cybersecurity, physical security, fraud, even sometimes trust and safety with the tech companies, as well as the U.S. government, right? That's where we all came from. And so that's what we did. And so that was always our North Star, is can we actually create a company that does, because intelligence is a service by its very definition. It's not data. It's ultimately providing timely, actionable, relevant information to solve problems. And that's kind of that's, I'm one of the co-founders of the company, so of course, that was the North Star always, right? And so as we kind of started going down the path, and we needed to ultimately look to solve problems, right? You heard the gentleman before from CrowdStrike. He was very much on the CIA triad: the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data systems. That's cybersecurity. We're not going to be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about everything around corporate intelligence and corporate security around the left side of the paradigm, right? So ultimately, what we have to do, we have to collect certain data and ultimately answer the certain problems. So what are the problems, right? A lot of corporate security officers, chief security officers, ultimately deal with these use cases, because in the end of the day, if it's commercially available, it's got to still solve the problem. These are generally the problems. So a couple things that I'll kind of highlight here. Executive protection. What data is important for executive protection? Well, you need a social media feed, right? You need information that ultimately is able to track IP addresses sometimes, if it's an email threat to an executive. If you need to ultimately attribute someone, you probably need breach data. Well, when you think breach data, you think cybersecurity problems. Well, that's not necessarily the case all the time. That's kind of what we needed to kind of go do. So if you really think about how we need to solve all these different types of problems, if you think about Nisos, right, we consume a lot of the data feeds that are around this building, fuse that into a federated search just for our analysts to use. So it's not necessarily accessible to the clients, it's accessible to analysts. And then we ultimately produce finished intelligence reports that's accessible potentially via API if that's needed, that ultimately solves your requirements, right? And I think that's the key thing. The gentleman from CrowdStrike earlier mentioned something about industry norms, right? That's table stakes. You need to solve problems that are specific to your organization. That's going to vary literally by every different organization, right? A retailer is going to have different problems than a tech company, is going to have different problems than a financial institution, right? And ultimately, if you have the bandwidth to go buy 20 different feeds and hire 20 analysts, I get it, right? But that's usually not the paradigm you really kind of work on. And so that's kind of what open source intelligence can really solve. These are usually the use cases that we generally get involved in. And these are pretty standard across most corporate intelligence teams, I would argue. If I'm wrong, let's have a conversation afterwards. I'm always trying to learn. But these are what the usual what they usually break down to. So ultimately, I kind of discussed how we solve what we solve, right? You bring in your RFIs, you bring in your requirements, and then of course we're going to produce and ultimately look to to perform some kind of engagement. We'll kind of get into what the engagements, the offerings kind of break down to. But look, I mean, it's generally an assessment, a monitoring service, or an investigation. So a lot of times we get mixed up with MSSPs, MDRs, right? Those types of outsourced SOCs, so to speak. We're only all outside the firewall. So right, so we don't collect data for your network whatsoever. So we're collecting all the different data outside. So what are some of those data feeds we have to do? Passive DNS, NetFlow, social media data, mobile data, right? All this types of data. I mean, again, we're going to buy it rather than go build a platform to scrape it, right? Like there's some things we will scrape for, but it's usually bespoke to what you want as the client, right? It's not trying to scrape everything to pull it into a feed and then you as the organization got to make sense of it. Like there's already enough noise out there. There's always enough problems to ultimately try to make sense of what you need. We're just going to give you the answers of what you need. So I mean, very succinctly, right? Like we regularly compete with a lot of different types of scraping companies. And look, if you have the manpower to triage 40,000 alerts, cool, right? But we're going to ultimately just give you the 30 alerts that really matter to your company, right? So when we talk about executive footprint, right? How can intelligence outside the firewall intelligence truly benefit an executive protection or a physical security program? And this is what we generally see as the different threats to executives that ultimately need to remediate against. One, I'll just pick on it just a couple, and like how you kind of expose these, right? I mean, the classic is, online impersonation, CEO fraud. I mean, so just to be able to, and you see this all the time, right? An executive for said company ultimately gets impersonated, and you ultimately need to remediate that. Well, to be able to do that, you got to be able to scrape or have access to every single social media platform out there. That becomes inherently pretty challenging. So of course we have a variety of different vendors, and our own capabilities are able to ultimately go and do that and have certain connections back to said companies that ultimately can get this remediated pretty quickly. Now look, we're not a takedown service. There's a lot of different capabilities to do that. But that is generally, that's kind of just give you a flavor of kind of like how we kind of tackle the problem. Pattern of life, right? Like, I think when we talk about a lot of different problems, right? If we're talking about retail, we work with a lot of different retailers, right? Everybody a lot of times wants that smoking gun. They want that event on social media that's going to prevent something, right? I mean, how many people ever worked surveillance in the previous lives? Any previous surveillance, right? I mean, sometimes it's pretty nauseating to watch the same guy go from point A to A to B, and you're like, okay, what am I seeing here? Well, then all of a sudden you get a tip that when he's carrying a red briefcase, right, all of a sudden that's when he's going to do a crime, right? It's not too dissimilar often when you're dealing with that same type of issue with online social media monitoring, right? Sometimes you have to ultimately see who the network is, see who's actually something, maybe there's a crime after the fact, right? And then all of a sudden you can actually attribute that individual. And then you look back at all the different times they post online, you start seeing trends. You start seeing tippers, you start seeing alerts. And then that starts to build out the process, so to speak. So sometimes people think that a pattern of life means that I'm going to get proactive intelligence to stop something. That's certainly always the case. But a lot of times, back to that surveillance example, you need different information, you need different signatures, so to speak, that ultimately kind of tip that will help paint more, again, back to what the previous speaker talked about, better context, right? So I think I've talked a little bit about this. Why manage intelligence? Again, we provide the answer. We provide the finished reports. We're not piping data, right? We're pretty strong on that because a lot of people can pipe data. We're piping the answers that are tailored to you. And again, like our product is the analyst, right? There's a lot of people sell a tech platform, and of course I get complained about all the time, like that's not scalable. Like somebody told me like that scaling intelligence analysis, you couldn't scale intelligence analysis. That, of course, I was like, oh, like hell we can, right? That's the entrepreneur in me, I guess. But no, but the bottom line is like our product is the analyst. It's not an actual technology platform. Our technology platform is proprietary to us. So ultimately, how do we go about doing what we need to do? It's a risk assessment, it's threat monitoring, or it's investigation. I think that's everybody kind of here kind of generally understands that capability. Okay, so now let's talk about like you got to monitor, right? There's a big difference between what is if you're an online actor, what is, and I'm talking about an executive, what is his address versus I'm going to that address, right? Those are very different types of alerts. One alert, you need to be calling somebody ASAP. The other alert, maybe we'll just monitor that, that social media handle, see what he's actually doing. That's the different kind of granularity and touch that we're kind of providing. That's different, right? Hopefully that's, kind of helpful. I like telling stories, right? Very high net worth individual family is constant, a constant threat of various groups. There was a specific alert of, I'm going in the building, I'm on the 6th floor, I take a picture, here's where I am in the office. And he's posting this on Reddit, right? Like that's something, and of course they're like, okay, like that's a near-term problem. We need to unmask this person. Who is it? Like we got to figure this out, right? That's the kind of monitoring we're able to kind of bring when we talk about just monitoring. It's not, hey, here's every time that your company was mentioned, in the dark web or the open web. No, it's like, what do you need to protect against, right? And that's usually that kind of brand, type of monitoring that is a little bit more bespoke. Of course, then it usually escalates to an executive, right? I just got again. I'll tell another story. Talking to an executive, he's being targeted regularly by the alt-right. He's very, he's controversial. And he made the comment. He says, somebody told me, that if you really, he was a CEO. He wasn't a believer in threat intelligence, right? His belief was, if you truly want to be safe, you have to have 24/7 security, and you have to have somebody around you all the time, right? And that was his, that was it. That's what he, that was his. What somebody told him, probably somebody from law enforcement. And again, that's cool, no problem. That's a decision. That's a business decision that was made. What's reality is there's certain social data brokers that are out there, and again, same type of monitoring that I kind of just talked about, like looking at all the different social media sites. But there's different data brokers, and I think we look at like 200 different data brokers, and like ultimately look to remove that type of information. And again, like there's other services, like Delete Me is a common one, but if you really want to do it well, there's enough data brokers out there that you can remove your online profile pretty well. And that's around your house, that's around your family, that's around your friends, whoever you want, right? That's kind of like a little bit of an offshoot of our monitoring service that's just focused more on an individual rather than an entity. And then, of course, next step is, of course, investigations. I kind of alluded to a certain, said investigation, right? Like all the time, certain things rise to the surface where you go from a monitoring engagement of like an alert to, okay, we have to take action to go a step further, right? And that's what this adversary insights is. Where this is different from a lot of our competitors, you're probably used to the credit system, right? I get a certain amount of credits, with my subscription to ultimately investigate something. We're not a credits, we are not a fan. A lot of our clients are saying, I'm tired of the credit system. So what we ultimately had to do is like bucket the entire set of problems that we're dealing with, from email attribution or phone number attribution down to, who is this threat actor group, right? And ultimately we bucket it to basically different types of tiers of investigation, and then ultimately there's an SLA on top of that, right? So there's a 4-hour, 8-hour, 16-hour, 32-hour, those, and of course there's, you know, a 24-hour response, 24-hour response, you know, 48-hour response on down the line. There's SLAs that work with that. And the big thing is, like, the questions you can ask are limited, right? If you want to, our key to that is you can ask as many questions as you want. You can ask one at a time. Now, if you want to ask more than one at a time, there's an economies of scale that comes with that. How am I at time? 5 minutes? Cool. 5 minutes left. So this is always a controversial topic, attribution, right? When to attribute, when not to attribute. And again, it's all about, to what the previous discussion was all about context, right? This is what we do really well. I'll be honest, like, we do this better than anybody. I'm not one saying, like, you know, beat my chest or, you know, be arrogant. We do this really, really well, right? How do we do this well? I've kind of talked about that a lot. But again, it's all about what the context is that you want to solve, right? Again, there's a big difference between where, you know, what is his address versus I'm going to his address, right? Like, when that is a issue, you know, if it's clear that you always see insider threat. So insider threat issues, almost always is going to be, if there's even a thought of insider threat, it's, you know, we need to attribute, right? So, you know, again, like, how do you attribute us? I love, you know, these stories, right? I'll tell the story. Company got popped. They got breached. And I had to make a hard decision of to pay or not to pay, right? They want to know who it actually was, right? Because you're not just going to pay, you know, somebody. You don't want to actually know who it is. And again, we didn't get involved in the policy side of, you know, to disclose, not disclose, pay, not to pay. Like, they just want to know, who is this, right? Of course, they pilfered a AWS bucket. That AWS bucket goes to a colo server. That colo server redirects to a virtual private server in India. Called up the virtual private server. He's a college kid, right? Said, you know, he was like, can we have access to the image of the server? And he says, sure, pay me $1,000. Like, sure, no problem. You know, we're a threat intelligence company. We weren't hiding who we were. And so, of course, we tie that server, you know, to look at a server on the internet. Sure enough, we see the registration details, right? And of course, he puts his fake email address. That same fake email address, take that email address, you put that against breach data, you get a password. You take that password, you query that, you get 20 other email addresses. You take those 20 email. I mean, these actors always make mistakes. I don't care if it's a cyber threat actor. I don't care if it's somebody robbing your store. I don't care if it's somebody that's threatening your executive. They all make mistakes, every single one, right? And sure enough, along that line, when you do that password analysis, along the line, they're reusing passwords, they're reusing email addresses, and ultimately they're going to slip up and use that same password with that same email address that was discovered somewhere in a data breach, right? So you see the cyber physical security convergence here, right? Global investigations. That's what that's what we're all about, right? And that's what we do really well. And so back to that last story, you know, so that we were able to get confirmation of that email, and then of course that same email that was his name, he used that same email to ultimately register a key to a certain cryptocurrency that was discovered out in the open, and that was like, okay, that's our man. So then, of course, the physical security team then goes, knocks on his door, is this you? And then that was the win. That's what Nisos is all about, right? And that's that kind of, I gave that example because that's always the example I like to use that kind of shows that cyber, physical security convergence. And welcome questions at this time. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.